The lights shimmered across the sleek floor of the television studio, the hum of equipment filling the air. The audience, a mix of Hollywood stars and global guests, waited for a night of banter and entertainment. Will Smith, charismatic and sharp in a midnight blue suit, grinned as he exchanged a wink with the host. This was one of those nights where the air felt light and the stakes felt low. A routine spot where Will would crack a few jokes, flash a smile, and give the world the charm that had made him an icon. But tonight, something unexpected was about to happen. Seated beside Will was a man with a quiet strength about him. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. His dark suit was plain, unembroidered, sharp but humble. The cameras framed him between Will and another guest, making the juxtaposition almost too perfect. Will Smith, a global symbol of success and style, and Traoré, a symbol of resilience and grounded dignity. The host smiled as he introduced both. Will responded with a wink to the camera, and then came the moment that changed everything. "So, Will," said the host with a playful glance, "you ever thought about running for president? You'd be going up against this guy." He pointed to Traoré. "And I gotta say, Will, at least you'd bring some serious style to the table." The crowd erupted in laughter. Will smiled, brushing an imaginary speck of dust from the lapel of his crisp suit. He glanced at Traoré and winked. "I mean, no offense, Mr. President," Will said, leaning toward him, "but it kinda looks like your tailor gave up halfway, huh?" The room bubbled with chuckles. Will shrugged, still smiling, the easy banter bubbling forth as it always did. But then, Traoré didn't smile. Not because he felt insulted, but because he felt something deeper stir within. The room fell silent as Traoré adjusted the microphone clipped to his lapel. Will glanced over, expecting an awkward chuckle, a wave of the hand. Instead, Traoré sat forward, folded his hands, and spoke in a voice that felt as if it came from somewhere deeper than the room itself. "I don't wear power, Will," Traoré began softly. "I carry it." The silence was almost palpable. Will froze, his smile faltering. "I am a man from a place where a shirt can cost more than a village's monthly water supply," Traoré continued, voice rising just enough for every person in the room to lean closer. "If I wear a $5,000 suit, it means 5 children walk 10 miles for water that might make them sick. Will, I don't wear my power. I carry it because for some people, my presence is all the protection." The room was suspended in silence. Will felt something inside him shift, a sting, a hum, an ache he hadn't felt in a long, long time. The audience didn't clap, didn't laugh. They watched. They listened. Traoré placed a hand on the table, still looking at Will. "You make movies that make people laugh, cry, and feel. That is a gift. But I carry the lives of people every day. Not because I am stronger than you, Will, but because I have no other choice. In Burkina Faso, we have learned that honor doesn't come from suits or applause or screens. It comes from knowing why you rise every morning and why you must never give up." Will felt the sting of emotion well in the corner of his eyes. The room felt smaller. Suddenly, the space between Will and Traoré felt like a bridge across continents, across worlds. Will didn't reply, not with a joke, not with a smile, not even with words. Instead, for the first time in years of appearances, interviews, and banter, Will Smith felt something rare rise within him: humility. He sank back in his chair, brushing a hand across his jaw, as if trying to wipe away the sting of those words. The audience didn't clap, because this was no performance. This was life, pure, unfiltered. After the segment, Will sat in silence as the camera crew dismantled equipment. The room felt charged. Will stood slowly and stepped down from the soundstage. Traore was there, standing calmly, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. Will crossed the room, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Mr. President," Will said quietly. Traore looked up. Will's voice shook just slightly as he spoke. "I needed that. Thank you." Traore offered a soft, warm smile. He placed a hand on Will's shoulder. "We all forget sometimes, Will. What we carry is more important than what we wear. You carry many hearts when you walk across that screen. Never forget that." Will nodded slowly. The moment felt like more than an exchange between a Hollywood star and an African president. It felt like a reminder, an awakening. Later that night, Will returned to his hotel room. The clip of Traore's words circulated online within moments. By midnight, it was everywhere. Will Smith humbled by President Traore. Will Smith speechless as leader from... But this wasn't about Will anymore. It was about Traore, about a quiet man from Burkina Faso reminding the world that grace can shout louder than bravado. As Will scrolled through the comments, one caught his eye. That wasn't a comeback, it was a lesson. Will learned tonight, and we learned with him. He sank onto the edge of the bed, brushing away the sting of emotion still lingering in the corner of his eyes. Will opened a notebook, one he hadn't used in years, and began to write. "Today, I met a man who spoke with silence, lived with strength, and reminded me why stories matter. Not for applause, but for purpose." The sound of the city outside felt far away. Will didn't post it. Not yet. It felt too raw, too sacred. But it felt real. And as Will closed the notebook and lay down that night, one thought settled in his heart. A man can walk in style, or he can walk with honor. The greatest men walk with both and wear neither. By morning, Will Smith awoke to the sound of countless notifications buzzing on his phone. The clip of Traore's words had gone viral, spreading like wildfire across social platforms. Everyone from teenagers to heads of state was sharing it. The headlines splashed across countless screens. Will Smith humbled by President Traoré, the moment the world listened. Will sank down onto the edge of the hotel bed, scrolling quietly. What he felt the night before had deepened into something profound. He tapped one video link and watched as Traoré spoke. The sound of the president's voice felt even more resonant in the morning stillness.
"I don't wear power, Will. I carry it."
Each word pressed down upon Will's heart until he felt as if he could hardly breathe. The comments section was flooded. This is how a true leader speaks. A lesson for every politician, every celebrity, every parent. He spoke to Will, but he spoke to all of us. Will felt ashamed at first, not because of the joke he'd made, but because for a moment, it felt like he'd forgotten what it meant to truly stand for something. Yet amid that sting came a rising sense of clarity. He wanted to understand, not just admire from a distance, but truly comprehend the strength that came from a place like Burkina Faso. He picked up the phone, called his assistant, and said quietly, "I need to go to Burkina Faso." There was a long pause on the line. "Are you sure?" came the reply. Will didn't hesitate. Yes, not for a movie, not for an interview, not for a headline, just to listen, to learn. And so, within days, Will Smith found himself on a flight that felt different from any trip he had taken before. Not surrounded by handlers, agents, and a camera crew, but traveling with only a few trusted staff and a heart beating with anticipation. Burkina Faso. News of Will's visit circulated quickly. The air felt electric as he landed in the capital of Ouagadougou. The skies were sharp and bright, the sun beating down upon earth that held the footprints of countless generations. President Traoré met Will quietly at the airport, surrounded by only a handful of staff. There was no pomp, no ceremony, just a smile, an outstretched hand, and words that felt like a beacon. "Welcome, Will." Not as a celebrity, not as an icon, as a guest, as a brother. Will felt a lump form in his throat. This was no film scene, no rehearsed role. This was life meeting life. Through the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, Will watched children hauling water from wells, watched mothers carry baskets upon their heads, watched men and women laugh despite harsh conditions, watched old men under the shade of a lone acacia tree. Will felt a profound sense of belonging and separation at once. He was a witness to a world that refused to break. That afternoon, Traoré brought Will to a humble school on the city's edge. The walls were worn, but inside was a hum of life. Will watched as Traoré spoke to a group of students, not as a politician making promises, but as a father reminding a room of children that their worth came from within. "Each of you," Traoré said, resting a hand upon a young boy's shoulder, "is a seed. The earth may be hard, the sun may be hot, but you have within you all that you need to rise. Do not wait for the world to give you permission to grow. Grow, because that is why you were placed upon this earth." Will felt the sting of tears rising again, not because the words were new, but because he felt their truth sink deep within the marrow of his being. That evening, Will and Traoré sat under the stars on a simple wooden bench. The sounds of the city shimmered faintly in the background. Will spoke first. "Mr. President, you said something to me the other night that shook me. Not because it offended me, but because it stripped away all the noise, all the masks, all the pretense. I've spent my life trying to make people laugh, trying to give people an escape, and I'm proud of that. But am I doing enough?" Traoré smiled, looking out toward the horizon. "The question is not, am I doing enough? The question is, am I doing what is true? You can give laughter, Will, And that is a gift. You can give beauty, Will, and that is a gift. What is enough is not measured by quantity, but by depth. What is enough is when your heart is aligned with your hands, and your voice is aligned with your truth. Will sank back, resting his head upon the wooden slats. The stars felt closer tonight. The air felt softer. Have you ever felt lost, Mr. President? Will asked, quietly. Traore nodded, brushing a hand across the bridge of his nose. Every man feels lost at some point, Will. The difference between those who find their way and those who wander forever is this. One chooses to remember why he started walking in the first place. Do you remember? Will smiled faintly. I started because I wanted to make a difference, to make people feel, to tell stories that matter. Then remember that, Traore said softly. The spotlight can illuminate, or it can blind. Let it illuminate, not just for yourself, but for those who walk beside you. The days that followed weren't captured by cameras. Will traveled with Traore to remote villages. He spoke to teachers and farmers, sat in modest classrooms, and watched how a quiet strength built communities that refused to yield to despair. Will felt something shift deep within him, a shift that no script, no role, no blockbuster could have offered. One evening, Will called Jada from a quiet room. I thought I came here for an apology, but this is a lesson, not for Will the actor, but Will the man, Will the father, Will the human being. Then listen, Jada said, voice warm. Listen like you've never listened before. And when you come home, don't just tell the story. Live it. Days later, Will stood beside Traore at a gathering of students and young leaders in Ouagadougou. Will spoke openly, voice shaking slightly as he addressed the audience. Today, I stand before you as a man changed, Will said. I came here thinking I had lessons to teach, ideas to share. But what I found was a reminder that strength is not about noise, not about applause. True strength is quiet. True strength is knowing that the measure of a person is in how deeply they walk with their truth. He turned to Traore and offered a slight bow. Mr. President, I came here for myself, but I will leave with your wisdom. The world needs more leaders like you, not because you have more power, but because you carry it with humility, grace, and honor. The room rose in applause. Will felt the sting of tears, not of shame, but of belonging. On the flight home, Will watched the horizon shift from deep African earth to open ocean. The hum of the engine felt like a lullaby. Will pulled out his notebook and began to write. Not a script, not a speech, but a promise. To carry more than I wear, to walk with honor, even when no one is watching, to listen as deeply as I speak, to remember that the best moments aren't those captured by the camera, but those captured by the heart. He signed it simply, with humility, Will. The weeks after Will Smith returned to Los Angeles felt different. The world still celebrated him as an actor, but Will felt himself reshaping as a man. The flood of messages about that night with Traore kept pouring in. Tweets, letters, emails, people stopping him on the street just to say, thank you for listening. Not as a character, not as a comedian, but as a human being. One morning, Will was sitting in his study, surrounded by old movie scripts and memorabilia from a life lived in the spotlight, when he came across a note he had scrawled upon returning from Burkina Faso. Carry the weight. Speak quietly. Stay rooted. Stay real. It felt like a mantra. Will stood and walked down the long hallway lined with framed posters of blockbuster movies, moments of glory and applause. Suddenly, it felt like an echo of a chapter that had passed. What came next, Will knew, had to be different. That afternoon, Will announced to his team that he was putting certain projects on hold. The films that felt routine, that felt like repeating a formula, he would step away from. Will felt a rising sense of conviction, not born from ego or impulse, but shaped by the quiet, humbling moments he had shared with Traore and witnessed across Burkina Faso. Meanwhile, across the ocean, President Traoré was grappling with the unexpected consequences of a moment meant only to teach and uplift. Letters poured into Burkina Faso from across the globe. Handwritten notes from middle school students, long emails from fathers grappling with broken relationships, messages from countless men and women seeking a quieter path, a more hopeful future. Each morning, Traoré read a handful aloud to his staff, not for ego, not for glory, but to remember why he spoke the words he spoke. To remember that moments can matter more than speeches. One letter came from a man named Alejandro in Mexico. Senor Traoré, I have lived with anger for too long. The night I watched the video of Will Smith and your quiet reply, I felt my chest grow still for the first time in years. Thank you for reminding the world that strength can whisper. Traoré set the letter down and stood for a long moment looking out the window. The world felt smaller somehow, more connected. A whisper can travel farther than a shout, he said softly to no one. In a quiet cafe in Philadelphia, Will met with a group of teenagers from underserved neighborhoods. They weren't there for an autograph or a picture. Will didn't come with a camera crew or a PR team. He came to listen. What do you want the world to understand about you? Will asked. One boy, shy and cautious, spoke first. That we're more than statistics, that when people see our neighborhoods, they forget about the dreams that grow here too. Will nodded slowly. I understand that, and you're right. Sometimes the world doesn't remember that quiet strength is growing in places no one is looking. Will you do something for me? The boy shrugged. Will smiled. Write it down, what you want the world to understand. Put it in words. Whatever you feel, whatever you dream. Will you do that? The boy nodded. Will promised to be back. Not with a camera, not with applause, but with ears ready to listen. In Burkina Faso, Traoré announced an initiative inspired by that same lesson, a program called Echoes of Truth, an initiative aimed at nurturing quiet leadership and communal strength within rural communities. The initiative was simple: build spaces where stories can be shared, where listening is valued as much as speaking, where dignity can rise from humility. Will Smith offered to help fund the initiative anonymously, not for the headline, but because it felt right. In one of their rare phone calls, Will said to Traoré, "You started something bigger than a conversation. You started a shift. Whatever you need to make that shift real, I'm here. Traore smiled quietly. Then walk with us, Will. Not in front, not behind, but beside. Together. 6 months later, Will returned to Burkina Faso, not as a visitor this time, but as a witness. Together, he and Traore traveled to a small village near the Ghanaian border. The people didn't recognize Will as a global movie star. They didn't ask for selfies. To them, he was just a man with a quiet smile and a listening heart. He watched as Traore spoke to a gathering of village elders and children. The words weren't fiery or complex. They weren't about politics or position. They were about belonging. We rise when we remember that no person is too small to matter, no voice too soft to be heard. Will felt the sting of tears and didn't shy away from them. Somehow, in this tiny space, surrounded by earth and sun, he felt freer than he had in years. A year passed. Will announced a foundation called Light and Silence, a global initiative inspired by the moments that reshaped him. Its goal was simple: build spaces for dialogue in underserved communities. Fund educational programs that teach the power of listening and humility. Partner with leaders like Traore to cultivate quiet, transformative moments across borders. In one of its first events, Will invited Traore to Los Angeles for a public conversation, not a rally, not a press conference, just a conversation between friends. Will spoke openly about how Traore had reshaped him. Traore spoke openly about how Will had shown him that change can move between hearts, regardless of borders or status. The room was packed with people. The lights were low, the sound was crisp, and silence spoke volumes.
Will turned to Traore and said, "That night when you spoke to me, you changed more than a moment. You changed a man. And through that man, countless others have been changed too. Thank you for reminding the world that true strength rests in listening and honoring others, in carrying ourselves with grace."
Traore smiled, brushing a hand across his chest. We carry ourselves. We carry the world. We carry it for ourselves, for each other, and for those yet to come. As Will stepped down from the stage that night, a boy handed him a note. Will opened it slowly and smiled as he read, "My name is David. I watched the video of you and President Traoré. I stopped fighting with my father that night. We started talking instead. Thank you for reminding us both how to listen." Will felt his breath catch, not for the applause, not for the role, but for this. The quiet knowing that moments can become ripples, ripples can become waves, waves can reshape shorelines. In Burkina Faso, Traoré kept the routine he had promised himself: the daily walk through the streets, the quiet meetings with children and families, the long moments of reflection at dusk. The world had called him a beacon of strength, a voice of integrity, but he smiled, knowing the truth. Strength is not born from being seen. Strength is born from seeing others.